If you could, for just a moment, try to imagine what it would be like if you had never stepped foot into a shul, if you had never been associated with any Jewish organization, and you could count on one hand the number of Jewish people you knew personally. That was me 20 years ago, and my husband. My husband and I feel like we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Rabbi Stern for pointing us in the right direction. He was the first rabbi that we ever met, and his shul was the first shul we ever stepped foot into. We're very happy to be here tonight, and I'm very happy to share my story. Now, it's been said everyone has a story. Probably like many of you, if I had been asked as a young girl to write a script for my life, it would have read much differently than the way my life is today. Many people have asked me, how did I, as a Baptist and a country girl raised in the middle of the Oklahoma Bible Belt, become an observant Jew? It's a long story with many twists and turns, but in hopes it may help someone else. Here's my story. To begin with, I was raised on a farm outside a small Midwestern town called Weatherford, Oklahoma. Weatherford was about 70 miles west of Oklahoma City. My father owned over 700 acres, and he farmed wheat and cotton. We had cows and chickens and pigs and horses and cats and dogs and a few other stray animals. So the farm was a big part of my life. But even bigger than that, and even more important, was the church. We were members of a Baptist church. It was a church of about 200 members called Broadway Heights Baptist Church. My family was very active in the church. My father was a Sunday school teacher. He also sang a lot of songs in the church. My mother was a Sunday school teacher. My brother was musically talented, so he played the piano for the youth group, and I was also a part of the youth group. The Baptist church taught many things about their beliefs, about quote, the Old Testament, New Testament, but the underlying theme of every sermon and every teaching was the importance of belief in Jesus. In fact, it was taught in order to have a relationship with God, in order to have a part in the world to come, you had to have a relationship with Jesus. And every sermon I ever heard, and every church service I ever attended, there was always an invitation song given at the end of the service where we were asked to come to the front of the church and to pray with the pastor if we didn't know Jesus so that we could be saved from the fires of hell. So this was etched in my inner core from as early as I can remember. So in addition to being raised on a farm and being raised in the church, of course, I also went to school. I went to school in Weatherford, which was a small school. I think my graduating class had 60 members. Once I graduated from high school, then I went to college, graduated in office administration, and took a job at the local 3M company. So I worked in personnel there till I was about 25, and then I finally came to the realization that if I ever thought I was going to have a chance of getting married, I probably was going to have to move to a bigger city than Weatherford, Oklahoma. So as hard as it was, I quit my job, and I packed up and moved to Oklahoma City. I took a job in downtown Oklahoma City at a bank called Fidelity National Bank. And of course, one of my biggest priorities was to find a good church. So I joined a large church called Council Road Baptist Church. It had over 1,000 members, and the biggest attraction for me was the singles group. Of course, they had a lot of singles there and a lot of activities. I made a lot of good friends, and I dated a few young men there, but no one ever really seemed to be the one until one fateful evening I was asked to take brownies to the home of Chuck Cagetta. Chuck was a member of our singles group, and he was hosting a men's Bible study one Tuesday evening. So he asked for some of the women to volunteer to bring refreshments to his apartment. I'd never been to Chuck's apartment, but my best friend Peggy happened to be dating Chuck. So I called her up and asked for directions, and I thought I had carefully written down the directions. I drove over to the apartment complex, and I go to the apartment, and I find out that I'm at the wrong apartment. So I go back to my car, and I'm sitting there trying to decide what to do, because at that time there were no cell phones. That was before the age of cell phones. So I'm sitting there with my brownies, and I'm thinking, well, maybe if I sit here long enough, someone will show up that I recognize, and they'll show me how to get to the apartment. So I'm sitting in the car, and all of a sudden I look in my rearview mirror, and there's this cream-colored Olds 88 car that comes driving behind me and parks about 2 slots down from me. And I glance over there, and all of a sudden, the door opens, and out emerges this handsome, svelte guy who gets out of the car with a Bible in his hand. And I rush out with my brownies and I go, "Excuse me, are you going to the Bible study?" And he goes, "Mm-hmm." And I went, "Oh, I am so glad, because I was sitting there with my brownies and I thought I had the right apartment and I didn't. And now I know what to do, because I can follow you and I can go to the Bible study and I'll know what to do and I can just give the brownies a check and everything will be fine." And he's like, "Mm-hmm." And I'm like, he sure doesn't talk so much. So we're walking to the apartment, and before we get to the door, he stops and he goes, "I'm Robert Schiermeyer." And I said, "Oh, it's nice to meet you. I'm Marcella Payne." Being terribly embarrassed, I drop the brownies off in Chuck's apartment and I go back to my car and make a quick exit. A couple of days later, the phone rings and the voice on the other end says, "Is this that woman that bakes those delicious brownies?" And I said, "I think so. Who is this?" And he goes, "Well, this is Bob Schiermeyer." And he began to reintroduce himself, and he said that he actually lived in Wichita, Kansas, that he was a member of the Air Force, but that he was coming to Oklahoma City because he had finally decided what he wanted to do with his life, that he wanted to be a doctor, and because he'd been a pilot for 9 years, he needed to go and take the MCAT test, and he needed to take some courses to prepare for that. And that's why he was in Oklahoma City. So before the conversation was ended, he asked me if I would be interested in an evening out with him. And I thought, well, he's told me he's president of his singles group in his church, so he must be a good Christian man. And he's been a pilot for 9 years, and he wants to go to medical school, so this could be pretty interesting. So I agreed to a night out with him. And I must admit that I was so totally charmed on that first date that I went back in the next day to my boss at Fidelity National Bank, and I announced that I met the man last night that I'm going to marry. And that prophecy rang true 6 months later. We did marry. In fact, we married on November 17th, 1984. Happy anniversary, sweetheart. And that's part of the reason why we're here. And he gave me this lovely necklace, and I want everyone on the count of 3 to say, "Ooh, ah." 1, 2, 3. Ooh. Yeah, thank you. But there was an incident that happened early on in our relationship that threatened to jeopardize the whole courtship. We had been dating just a few short weeks, and I had invited Bob to come for dinner one evening. He was working in Wichita, but he was going to come to Oklahoma City and join me for dinner. So I was so excited because I thought, this is the one, that I took off work that day just so I could prepare everything as nicely as possible. I cleaned my apartment from top to bottom. I planted fresh flowers in the flower bed, and I wanted to prepare the most sumptuous meal that I knew how to cook. So he shows up from Wichita, and he sits down on the couch that evening, and I'm putting the final touches on dinner. And I say, "So, what have you and Wayne been studying lately?" Wayne was his roommate, and they had a lot of very interesting Bible studies. And his response was, "Well, lately we've been studying the Jewish dietary laws, and we don't really know the reason for them, but we figure it's probably a pretty good idea to try and follow them." Anyone want to guess what I prepared for dinner? Beitam. So the evening did not go quite as I had planned, but I thought, it'll be okay. So the next day we did some shopping and we ran some errands, and that afternoon we stopped for a quick bite to eat at the Burger King. And I think I ordered a cheeseburger and fries, and he was very careful to make sure that he didn't order anything that had beaten cheese together. So we sit down at the table, and Bob's telling me this whole story about something, and in my mind, I'm not hearing a word that he's saying, because all I'm thinking about is, well, he didn't eat the ham last night, so that must mean he doesn't eat pork, and he's not going to eat meat and cheese together, and maybe I need to rethink this whole thing. And so I just interrupt him in what he's saying. I say, "Why is it that you think you have to keep kosher when you're not Jewish?" And he goes, "I don't know, I just figure it's probably a pretty good idea." So a rather steamy argument ensued, and shortly thereafter, I asked him if he would like to go home. So I remember that as he was leaving my apartment, he looked at me and sighed, and he said, "I just realized this is probably the last time I'll ever see you." And I said, "Oh, no, silly, no, it won't." Although I was so upset with him, I was thinking it probably would be. But then he called me the next week, and he apologized. He said, "I don't know what got into me. I'm so sorry." He sent me flowers, and I thought, maybe I like this man a lot after all. And as I said, we were married on November 17th, 1984, and marriage to this man has brought me more excitement and more adventure than I could ever imagine. So we got married, and a few months later, he was accepted into medical school at the Uniformed Services Health Sciences Center in Bethesda, Maryland. So we go there, and he starts medical school. And a couple months later, 11 months after we were married, we were blessed with our first son, a beautiful baby boy. So I was busy being a mommy, and he was busy in medical school. And he was also busy teaching Sunday school there in Bethesda. 2 years later, we were blessed with another son, and that was about the end of his third year of medical school. So at that same time, Bob calls me one day from school, and he says that he needs to put in his request for the fourth year of school. The fourth year of school is all clinical work. There's no classroom work, so he needed to request where he was going to work at. So I obviously say, well, let's keep it in Maryland. He goes, no, you can't do that. He said, you have to go other places out of state. So I need to pick where I want to go and when I want to go. So I said, well, let me think about that. Here I have 2 new babies, and I didn't want to be left by myself. So I said, well, why don't you see if you can do all your rotations in San Antonio, and we'll just move there. And he said, well, I don't think the Air Force would sign off on that. And I said, well, just ask them. Well, it turns out they did. They said that we could move there for his fourth year of medical school. So, excuse me just a minute. I'm going to get a drink because my mouth is getting very dry. So, so we pack up and we move to San Antonio. The first week that we're there, Bob is doing in-processing at the base. My kids are with my parents, and I'm sitting there in the house, in this big empty house, trying to decide what it's going to be like living in San Antonio. We have no furniture yet. We're in a fairly new development with not a lot of neighbors, and I'm looking out the window, and I'm trying to decide, how many neighbors we're going to have and what it's going to be like living there. And as I'm looking out the front window, I see this car pull up in the driveway across the street. And this woman gets out, and she has 2 small children that look like they're similar in age to my children. And I'm thinking, maybe I should go over there and introduce myself. And then I'm thinking, but we're moving, maybe I should take a shower, and maybe I should change clothes before I go over there. And I thought, no, I just need to show myself friendly to my neighbors. I'm going to go over there and I'm going to introduce myself. So I get up my courage and I run down our steep driveway and I go over and I say, hi, I'm Marcella, I'm your new neighbor. She goes, oh, I'm Kathy, it's nice to meet you. And the more we talked, the more we found out that we had a lot in common. Her husband was also in the Air Force, and he was a doctor, and we had children with similar ages, and so we became very good friends very quickly. And soon I learned that Kathy was not Jewish, but that her husband was. And he was not observant at the time, but he was still Jewish, and and she wasn't, but we became very good friends. We did a lot of things together, but after knowing the Rossios for about 2 years, the Rossios were transferred to Dayton, Ohio. So I remember the last day before they moved, I remember helping Kathy with her children and with cleaning the house, and I remember hugging her tightly and saying, Kathy, I'm going to miss you so much, and crying, not knowing how much their lives would play into ours later down the road. Because 2 years later, my husband gets word that he's being transferred to Dayton, Ohio. We didn't know a whole lot about Dayton, but we did know that the Rossios lived there, so we were excited about that. So we get to Dayton, and we call up the Rossios, and we say, we'd like to come over and see you. And so they said, sure, come on over. And we get there, and they open up the door, and things had taken a dramatic turn from the way we used to know them. Because Rob was now Ruvain. He was wearing a yarmulke and tzitzits, as were his 2 sons. And Kathy was dressed very modestly with a snood, and her daughter was dressed very modestly. There were lots of pictures of rabbis on their wall. They gave us a tour of their house, and they said, and here's where we keep our meat dishes, and here's where we keep our dairy dishes. And things were so much different than the way we used to know them. And just a few weeks later, Kathy called us to say that she and Ruvain were being remarried because she was going through conversion, as were her kids. So we went to the wedding, and I remember that in itself was a true experience for me. That was the first time I ever sat into a shul. I believe they got married in a house, but then they had the celebration at the shul, at Rabbi Stern's shul. And so you got to remember that I was raised as a Baptist. We were raised to believe that dancing was a sin and that you shouldn't do it. And so here are all the women dancing, and and I'm saying, don't ask me to dance, it's a sin, and plus I don't know how to anyway. But but it was a very interesting experience, and it was nice to see Ruvain and and now Rivka, married and living a Jewish observant life. At the same time, my husband and I were very busy in the church. My husband was, again, a Sunday school teacher, and I had come to a point in time in my life where I was very happy, but it was time for reevaluation. I was in my mid-30s. I was happily married. I had 3 sons at this time, all healthy and intelligent and, just very good family. Things were good for me. But I felt like that I wasn't depressed, but I feel like there was something more that I wanted with my relationship with God. I didn't know what it was because I felt like I had done everything I knew to do to be a good Christian. I had prayed to be saved. I had gone to church every time the doors were open. I read my Bible. I volunteered. I did everything I knew to be a good Christian, and yet I felt like that there was something more there that I wanted in my relationship with God. And so one night before going to sleep, I remember praying and saying, God, I really want to know you no matter what the cost. Please lead me into a deeper relationship with you. Little did I know what was to follow. Because I reasoned after that if I really wanted a deeper relationship with God, then perhaps I needed to read my Bible more seriously and be willing to do whatever it said to do, no matter what that was. So I began to study my Bible more seriously, and one of the first things that was drawn to my attention was the issue of head coverings. Now, even in, quote, the New Testament, it talks about the importance of women covering their hair. And my husband and I had talked about this when we were dating, and it was a very sensitive issue because he said he thought it was a good idea, and I said, well, no one in the church does it, and if they don't do it, then I don't know why I should have to do it, and I just wish you'd quit talking about it. Let's just be quiet about it. But then the more I read and the more I studied, it seemed to imply that women should be doing this. So I became very convicted about this. And it also bothered me because I thought, why is this bothering me so much? I've said I want a closer relationship with God. I've said I'm willing to do whatever the Bible says to do, and I can't even do this one thing to cover my head. So I finally decided, okay, I'll get a hat and I'll wear it to church, and that'll be a start. But when I went to church, and our 300-plus member church wearing a hat, I feel like I couldn't be more noticed than if I was like a billboard with neon flashing lights, because no one else in our church covered their hair. And I also felt like everyone thought that was my poor attempt at trying to be stylish. So I thought, okay, well, maybe that's a little bit too noticeable, so maybe I could be more discreet, and I'll get a pretty scarf, and I'll sit in the back of the church, and when they pray, then I will just discreetly lift the scarf over my head, and this will make me feel like at least I'm doing something to cover my head. So I sit in the very back row of the church, I take a scarf, and when they pray, I cover my head. And at the end of the service, one of my friends in the front row turns around, she goes, Marcella, I saw you back there with your scarf on. Well, that wasn't so funny to me. But the issue of head coverings soon took a back seat to a much larger looming issue. Because just a few weeks later, my husband came home and announced that he was being sent to a continuing medical education conference in San Antonio with Ruvain Rossio. He was very excited about going with Ruvain because Ruvain was a nice traveling companion. You didn't have to worry about off-color jokes, you didn't have to worry about inappropriate behavior, and usually they had very animated conversations about religion. Well, this trip was no exception. Because on this trip, Ruvain had just been to a conference by Rabbi Toby Singer called Let's Get Biblical. He was very excited about it, and he shared many of the points that he had learned from the conference with my husband. So I remember when Bob came back from the conference, we were driving around Fairborn near the Air Force Base, and I still remember what street we were on, and he was driving. He said, Ruvain had some really good questions that he posed while we were on that conference. And my response was, I'm sure Jews have some crafty way to explain away why they don't believe in Jesus, and I think you should just ignore him. He said, no, those were good questions. He said, they deserve an answer. And he began to share with me some of the questions. One of them had to do with the genealogy of Jesus, and one of them had to do with some of the accuracy of the New Testament. And in my mind, I thought, okay, it'll be interesting for him to research that and see what the answer is, but I'm sure it'll come out that Christianity is valid, and it'll just show that our beliefs are even that much more true. So he began to study and he began to question. In addition to researching those questions, Ruvain asked if he'd be willing to listen to the entire tape set that Rabbi Singer had produced, which was an intense tape set that covered many different areas of Christian doctrine. So Bob agreed that he would do that. Well, after he listened to the tapes, he said that Rabbi Singer characterized Christianity better than any pastor he knew. And I should point out here that my husband was a very serious student of the Bible. He read, he had a massive library. In fact, when he taught his Sunday school classes, he had the entire book memorized by heart. If you were to go to him today and say, I know this is in the Bible, but I don't know where it's at, he can tell you where it's at. He has a photographic memory. He had studied intensely. So when he listened to these tapes, he said that all of a sudden, the questions that he'd had before about Christianity, he said that all of a sudden he knew why he'd had problems, because there were problems. He said all the dots began to connect and all the loose ends began to come together. And he said he knew there was a problem with Christianity because there was a problem. So my response was, I can't believe this is happening. I was devastated. I thought, this good Christian man is questioning all our beliefs. I don't know what to do. But I thought, well, maybe he just doesn't have the faith that I have. And I will pray for him, and hopefully this will just all resolve because this is such a serious issue. So for the next few weeks, it was rather tense in our home because he's studying and he's learning and he's reading, and I'm praying for clarity and to know what the truth is. So one day, he's gone to work, and my kids are gone, and I'm cleaning house. And I walk into his office, and I see the workbook of Rabbi Singer laying there on his desk, plus the tape set. And I'm thinking, I don't know what could be so troubling to Bob. I don't know what could be such a big deal. So I pick up the workbook, and I just kind of thumb through it. And the first thing I look at is where it talks about the oneness of God. And it says, I, the Lord your God, am one. There's no other beside me. But Rabbi Singer asked the haunting question, if God wanted the world to know that there's only one God and no other, what would he have to say? And then he had verse after verse after verse about there is no other Savior besides me. I'm not a man, I'm the Son of Man. Jesus was referred to as the Son of Man. And there must have been like 20 to 30 verses there about the oneness of God. And I remember looking at that and thinking, wow, I've never seen that before. And then I turned over to another part of the workbook where he talks about the accuracy of the New Testament scriptures. Now, I was told that even the English translation of the Bible was totally inerrant, that everything was correct. In fact, one very well-known pastor had said that if you could find even one mistake in the Bible, that would call into question the whole credibility of the Bible. So I'm looking at this, and Rabbi Singer has a lot of glaring discrepancies of the gospel accounts in the New Testament. I'm thinking, wow, I never saw that before either, because he had them just lined up next to each other. And I thought, well, we just need to talk to someone who could really just resolve this and set this straight. So it should be pointed out here as well that in Christianity, it's not a popular thing to ask questions. If you want to ask a question about the order of the books in the New Testament, if you want to ask a question about Paul's missionary journeys, that's okay. But you cannot ask a question about the deity of Jesus. That is off limits. And yet we were questioning this, and we were having problems here. So I told my husband, you need to go to our pastor, and you need to tell him what the problem is and ask him to help us. So we made an appointment with the pastor, and he went to him and started to talk to him, and he held up his hand. He said, Bob, he said, I just have faith that what I believe is true, and that's good enough for me. Well, he was a very nice man, and it was good that he had faith, but that didn't help us. And so the next few weeks were a lot of research and a lot of reading. We tried to order all these Christian books that said, your hard questions answered, but unfortunately, the questions they answered were not the questions that we had. And so we tried to talk to other pastors, we tried to talk to other leaders, but we weren't getting a lot of answers. So in an attempt to get some discourse and to get some help, Bob sat down and he wrote a very short paper about some of the key issues that Rabbi Singer addressed. He talked about the Trinity, and he talked about the oneness of God. And he wrote this in a small paper, and he gave it to 3 or 4 of his closest friends in his Sunday school class. And he asked them if they'd be willing to take a look at it and be willing to discuss it. Initially, those papers were met with silence. Nobody said anything, nobody responded. And then finally, we got a call one day from one of the members of the class saying they had read the paper and that they would like to meet with us. And our response was excitement, because we thought, finally, someone's going to talk to us. They're going to have discourse. We didn't care if they agreed with the paper. We just wanted them to talk to us. We just wanted them to have discussion with us. So they set up the meeting for December 1995. Now, I was so excited that these men were coming to our house that I wanted to make sure everything was in order. The Christmas tree had its bright twinkling lights on. I had the spiced tea bubbling on the stove, and I had the brownies baking in the oven so that the whole mood would be set. They would come in and we would have this wonderful discussion. So the men show up at the front door, and Bob and I hurried to the front door to answer the door. But these men looked like they had just come to pay a Shiva call. And they came walking in and they sat down at the kitchen table. And I said rather tentatively, anyone want some coffee? They're like, no. How about some spiced tea? No. How about some brownies? No. So they sit down at the table, and I'm just staying in the kitchen observing everything, and my husband sits down. And they say, so Bob, who do you think Jesus is? At that time, we're still struggling with a lot of issues. And he goes, well, he's my Lord and Savior. And they said, so what do you think of the Trinity? And he said, well, I think it's idolatry. And they said, and he began to try to explain why he believed that. And they said, Bob, you'll know more than we ever know. And so they said, with a belief like this, what are you doing as a member of our church? And about that time, there was another knock on the door, and it was Steve. He was our neighbor. He was also a member of the church, and he had heard about this meeting. He said, well, you know, I'm not so biased. He said, maybe I could come and be a mediator. So he comes walking into the kitchen table, and the men look up at him, and they go, what are you doing here? And he's like, well, I heard about the meeting. I just thought I could come and be a mediator. And they're like, no one asked you to come be a mediator. And so they talked for a little bit longer, and then I'm staying in the kitchen with tears streaming down my face, and I stepped over the table, and I said, could I just ask one thing? I said, if everything you had ever believed in was being called into question, and you were told that you were going to burn in hell if you didn't believe that, wouldn't you want someone to talk to you? Wouldn't you want someone to help you? And the leader of the group said, Marcella, the women of the church, they really like you. They really do. And I'm really sorry for this. And with that, they got up and left, and we were out of the church. So I remember thinking, I can't believe this is happening. This was my whole identity. This is what I was raised with. And now we're no longer a part of the church. I was sitting on the couch crying, and Steve was still there, the mediator, and he walked over and he goes, well, Marcella, it's not like it's the end of the world. Maybe to him it wasn't, but to me it was. And I didn't know what was to be from there. It's like, I didn't know how we were going to explain it to my parents. I didn't know how we were going to raise our kids. I didn't know how we were going to have friends. Obviously, we weren't going to have church services anymore. I didn't know where to go from there. So Bob came to me and he said, well, so what do you want to do? And I said, well, how about, since we don't exactly know what we're going to do yet, let's just find a really small Baptist church where nobody knows us and go there and keep our mouths shut about what we think or what we believe, because we still need to teach our children. So we found this really small little church in Beyneynu, Ohio, where we lived, and we decided we would go there. And the first Sunday we were there, they came up to us and they went, oh, welcome, are you new here in town? And we're like, oh, no, but your church was just so small, we just never saw it before. So we started going there, and it was only a few weeks until there was one Sunday when Bob leaned over to me and he said that he was going out to the van. He said that his back was really hurting. He'd had 2 back surgeries and he could not sit in those hard pews. So I sat through the rest of the service with the boys. When I got out to the van, he was sitting there with his Bible, intently reading something else. And he said that he'd never seen this before. It had to do with the sacrificial system and, again, how Christianity had mischaracterized it. And when we got home, he took his Bible, he threw it on the couch, and he said, I'm never going back. And to hear that news was sort of like if you were to hear the news that you have a friend who has a debilitating illness, passes away. You're not totally surprised, but I was numb. I didn't know what to do. And so this is when depression set in. Because, again, I kept thinking, what's to be? How am I going to tell my parents? How is my relationship going to be affected with my parents, with my brother, with my friends? How am I going to raise my kids? I don't know what's to be. And I did a lot of crying, and I didn't want my husband to see it. I didn't want my kids to see it. So I would go in the bathroom, and I would pray to die. And I admit that that was the wrong thing, and I would never advocate it for anyone. And I've since asked forgiveness for that. But I prayed to die because I thought this was my life, this was my identity, and I couldn't deal with it anymore. So needless to say, it was very difficult. One of the things we did was we met with Rabbi Stern. The Rossiel family said, well, you can go and you can meet with our rabbi, and perhaps he can help you. So we went to meet with him, and we would go there. And at that time, I had one son. 2 older boys were in school, and the third son was about 3 or 4 years old. So it was so cute because we would show up at Rabbi Stern's shul, and he would take our little boy, Stephen, into the kitchen. He had the big blue eyes and long blonde hair, and he'd be standing there, and he'd be like, so would you like something to drink? And he'd go, how about some Dr. Pepper? And he'd be, mm-hmm. And then he'd get him some like Pringles or some potato chips. So he was so happy, and he would sit quiet the whole time while Bob and I bombarded Rabbi Stern with questions. And I remember that during one of our discussions, we mentioned to Rabbi Stern that we were soon going to be transferred to Oklahoma City. I remember Rabbi Stern saying, well, that's sort of a spiritual wasteland. Are you sure that you couldn't be transferred somewhere else? And in my mind, I was thinking, no, I want to go back there because that's my home. And if anyone can help me, and if anyone can give us answers, it would be in my home state where I grew up with my parents and with the church leaders there, because that's the middle of the Oklahoma Bible Belt, and they could help us and they could point us in the right direction. So we moved to Oklahoma. We moved to Oklahoma City. And I must say that time there brought me the most challenges and the most trials I've ever had in my life. Because we moved to Oklahoma City, and the first thing we dealt with was the relationship I had with my parents. When they heard that we were no longer in the church, and not only that we'd been asked to leave, they were devastated. And then on top of that, I was homeschooling my children. They used to be in private Christian schools. They couldn't be there anymore. They couldn't be in a Jewish school. And the public school left much to be desired. So my parents were never big proponents of homeschooling, but the fact that their daughter was doing it and their daughter was no longer in the church was a big bombshell. So that was a very difficult situation to deal with. On top of that, when we got to Oklahoma, I was diagnosed with bladder cancer. And I remember thinking, you know, a lot of times when things happen, you ask yourself, why did this happen? And of course, the doctor told me that it was a real puzzle to him why I had bladder cancer, because he said most bladder cancer patients are men, and the women that have it are usually in their late 50s or 60s. I was in my 30s, and they're heavy smokers or they've been exposed to heavy chemicals. Well, I never smoked, and I grew up on a farm. So you can imagine what I thought when I prayed to die in the bathroom and I was diagnosed with bladder cancer. So I had to go through a round of chemo and deal with the cancer. And then also at that time, I realized that I never had really sat down and listened to all Rabbi Singer's tapes. I'd looked at the workbook. I knew there were enough questions there that I couldn't go back to church, but I didn't really solidify what my beliefs were. So I sat down with Bob at the kitchen table. Of course, he had already listened to all of them, but I sat down with him, and I went through the painful task of listening to every tape that dealt with all the Christian doctrines. And it was a very painful thing to do, because he basically was dismantling everything that I believed. And even though deep down in my heart I knew there was a problem, I didn't know what to do about it, and it was scary. And so kind of as another last-ditch effort, I made this suggestion to my husband. I said, you know, just 2 or 3 miles from our house was Southern Baptist Church of Del City. Now, their pastor had been president of the Southern Baptist Convention several years ago, and he'd made this controversial statement that God does not hear the prayer of the Jew. I don't know if you remember that, but he was pastor of that church. And they had come out with a new mission statement for that year, which was to evangelize the Jew. So I said, well, if they want to evangelize the Jew, then perhaps they need to listen to these tapes. And if they can listen to the tapes and they can, refute them, then that's how they evangelize the Jew. So we called up and we made an appointment with the associate pastor to go and meet with him and explained to him our situation and asked him if he would be willing to listen to the tapes. So the first meeting we had, he was very cordial. He met with us and he told us how hopeful he was for us and how he would be able to help us. He told us how well behaved our kids were, and he just said that he was just really anxious to help us. And then he made an appointment for us to come back a second time. So we went back a second time, and this time his demeanor was totally different. And he looked at my husband, he said, "I told you not to share those tapes with anyone." And what had happened was that my husband worked in the emergency room, and one of the technicians overheard him talking to someone about these tapes, and he begged to listen to them as well. And my husband initially resisted and said, "No, I don't think it's a good idea." And he kept saying, "Oh, but I'm so good in apologetics, and I've studied so much. Please let me listen to them." Well, unbeknownst to my husband, this technician and his wife were members at this Southern Baptist Church in Del City. So they listened to the tapes, and the wife called up in tears to the pastor, and he said, "Where did you get the tapes?" My husband. So the pastor said, "I told you not to discuss this with anyone." He didn't listen to the tapes. He dismissed us, never to be heard from again. So I finally resigned myself to the fact that, yes, I had been raised in a generation. Jeremiah tells us that our fathers and forefathers have inherited lies, of which there is no profit. And I realized I was part of that generation. But again, I didn't know what direction to go to. And of course, there was something else that took my attention away from that as well, because after listening to the tapes and almost finishing up the homeschooling year, I started feeling pretty tired in the afternoons and taking a lot of long naps. And I found out that I was pregnant. So when I went in for my first OB appointment, the nurse heard the heartbeat, and I came home very excited and told my husband I heard the heartbeat at 197 beats a minute or whatever it was. And he goes, "That's kind of fast for one baby. Maybe you have two babies in there." I said, "No, I'm not having twins." Well, I don't think so anyway. And so he said, "Well, why don't you come out to the emergency room tonight and I'll just do a quick ultrasound." So that's what I did, and the room was empty that night, so he took me in, and there were two little babies. So I was pregnant with twins. And I went to the doctor. They had to send me off base because I was a high-risk pregnancy, and they told me, "Well, because you're 40 now, and you have twins, and you've had cancer, here's all the horrible things that can happen to you." And I remember being very scared, and I remember praying every single day and asking God, "Please make these babies healthy, and please make them beautiful." And thank God he did. And on January 16th of 1998, I delivered a boy and a girl, both 6 pounds, 7.5 ounces, beautiful, beautiful babies. And they are still a huge delight to us today. So God blessed us very, very much. So about the time they were born, we got word that Tinker Air Force Base was being closed. And so we were moving again, this time to Colorado Springs, to the Air Force Academy. Now, I never thought I would be happy to live in a community where there was not a lot of church influence, but this time I was, because I got tired of people asking me, "So what church do you go to?" Because when they would ask me in Oklahoma City, I would literally burst into tears because I thought they don't know the whole story, they don't know what's going on. I didn't have to deal with that in Colorado Springs. So we moved there. And initially, we did what we called Torah time, where we would just study the parsha of the week, and our kids would be rewarded monetarily if they would learn it, and they were able to answer questions. And that was basically the extent of our studying, because we had no connection with anyone Jewish, we had no connection with the shul, and so we were trying to learn on our own. I also know that I was trying to do some semblance of a Shabbos dinner, especially what I knew would be a Shabbos dinner. And I remember one night I said to my husband, I said, "Okay, well, you know what? Maybe we could do the prayers like if we were Jewish. Why don't you just lead us and we'll listen?" And he was working on his Hebrew, and I remember he takes out his siddur and he starts reading and reading and reading. And I'm like, "Honey, I don't think we have it right because no one would pray that long." So, I can tell you there's a huge difference between trying to learn something on your own and being in a Jewish community where they can teach you the right way. So this went on for about a year, and then one night we got a call from Rabbi Eisenman in Baltimore, Maryland. And he called to see how we were doing. Now, it's a long story how we knew Rabbi Eisenman. Basically, Rabbi Stern put us in touch with him. Rabbi Eisenman had written a book on the book of Job, or the book of Eov, and my husband found that very helpful. So he had a lot of correspondence with Rabbi Eisenman, and Rabbi Eisenman knew our situation, so he called to see how things were going. And Bob said, "Well, they're going okay, but he said, we don't have any connection with anything Jewish. We know there's something in Denver, but we don't know who to contact. We don't know where to go. And so Rabbi Eisenman explained that he had a grandson at the yeshiva there in Denver, and he said that he was going to call up the principal and make an appointment for us to go meet with him. So that's what he did. So a few weeks later, we find ourselves driving to Denver to meet with Rabbi Feldheim at Yeshiva Torres Chaim. Rabbi Feldheim was so kind to us, like Rabbi Stern was. He invited us in. He offered us food to eat. He offered my kids to go play at his house. He said, we've got plenty of toys. He said, I've got kids the same age. And he sat down with us, and he listened to our concerns, and he listened to our questions. And I remember that he treated every question as though it was so valid and that it was a good question. I remember now they seem like such trivial questions, but then it was like, well, Rabbi Stern, it's coming up on Christmas and we don't celebrate it anymore. And, people say Merry Christmas. And so what do we say back? And, I was just so concerned about all these issues, but he took every question so seriously. And then when we were done meeting with him, he gave us a tour of the yeshiva, and we saw the bookstore, and it was locked up. And it's like, oh, could we go in there? And he unlocked the door, and we bought some books, and we bought some music, because at the time, we weren't listening to Christian music. We didn't have Jewish music. It was like the 3 weeks all over again, So, so anyway, we got some music, and as we were driving back that evening, we put the music, into the tape deck, and we're listening to it. Such good music, and we're driving back, and we're talking about how good it was to meet with Rabbi Feldheim, and we'd had a drought in Colorado, and all of a sudden we see a few little flakes on the windshield, and those flakes got bigger and bigger. And by the time we got back to Colorado Springs, which was only about a 45-minute drive, we had so much snow we could barely make it up the hill into our garage. And the kids were out with their snow shovels jumping up and down and yelling, there's a snow day tomorrow. And it was like a huge blizzard. And I looked at my husband and I said, well, perhaps just as our physical drought is ending, maybe our spiritual drought is coming to an end as well. And so it was, because the next week, my husband said that he would like to go back to Denver to visit H. Denver. This was a synagogue that Rabbi Feldheim had recommended. It was an outreach shul, and he said that they had classes almost every night of the week and also during the day. So Bob went there to check it out. And he said that Rabbi Meyer gave a Parsha class, and he said that he didn't usually encourage non-Jews to come to that class, but since Rabbi Eisenman had recommended us, it was okay. So he went there, and he really, really liked it. He really liked the people there. He really liked the neighborhood. And he came back and really encouraged me to go there as well. So I tried to go one Shabbos, but it was a little bit challenging because at this time the shul was very young and there was no formal childcare, and I would try to go there with twins, and trying to hold twins on your lap during a service is a little bit challenging, and they weren't so quiet. And so finally I said, I'm just going to stay home and do the Torah time with the kids, but if you want to go to classes, that's fine. So that's what we ended up doing for several months. But then there was a day when Bob brought home this flyer from H. Denver, and it said that there was going to be a special talk given by a woman named Lori Palatnik. She was going to be taking a mission trip to Israel, and she wanted to speak to the women on a Wednesday night. So I remember that Bob brought that home to me, and he said, why don't you go listen to it? Now, I didn't know a lot of people in the Jewish world, but I did know Lori Palatnik. It was funny the way I knew her. The way I knew her was through the Rossios. When we got ready to leave Dayton, they brought us this pretty wrap gift, and they said, we want to give you a gift before you go away. And opened it up, and it was this book called Friday Night and Beyond by Lori Palatnik. And I remember thinking, well, why did they give us this? Because, we're not like studying Judaism, but thank you so much. So I put it in the drawer. But then when I took it out later and read it, I realized that it was actually a very good book. And now she was coming to Denver to speak. So I remember saying to Bob, well, I've got the kids, and I can't drive there by myself. I don't see so well at night. He goes, look, I'll drive you there. I'll watch the kids. You just go hear her speak. So we went there, and she gave a very inspirational talk. She talked about the role of Jewish women in history, and she talked about the influence that her grandmother had had on her. And I was very touched, and I was very inspired by the talk that she gave. So that night, as we're driving back to Colorado Springs, I'm trying to tell my husband about Lori's talk and about the things that she shared. And I said to him, I think if I could just have someone like Lori to speak to or even to learn with, I think that would help me so much. Well, Hashem must have been listening, because it wasn't too long after that my husband retired from the Air Force, and we had to decide where to go, where to live. And initially I thought, well, let's just stay in Colorado Springs because that's the easiest thing to do. He could already have a job there. We wouldn't have to take our kids out of school and move them again. But then the other side of the coin is, here we were spiritually not knowing what direction to go. And I thought, if we stay in Colorado Springs, we will always be saying, we're thinking about conversion. You know, we're studying and we're thinking about it, but as long as we never made the move, that's where we would be for the rest of our lives. And we finally decided that we could move to Denver. We didn't have to make the commitment to convert, but we at least need to be in a community where we could learn and we could be around other Jewish people. So that's what we ended up doing. We moved to Denver, and 2 weeks after we were there, they announced there was going to be a Shabbaton with the Platnik family. So I was so excited because I'd heard her before, and I was happy to see her again, and I went to her class, and it was just a wonderful Shabbos. And then at the end of the evening, they were doing Havdalah, and I remember I was standing up next to Lori, and when it was all finished, I turned to her and I said, you know, I really enjoyed your classes today. Thank you so much for coming. And she said, oh, you're welcome. And she said, see you soon. I thought, is that see you soon? Like, is that kind of like Shavua Tov, see you soon? Maybe it's just a Jewish phrase. I don't know. See you soon. But then that week, my friend told me that the Platniks had been called to be staff members at H Denver. And I was so excited because it was like she really brought an energy to the shul that was very special. So she and her husband came there, and I started going to her classes every week. And one of our concerns when we started attending shul was our children and how they could get involved Jewishly and how they would be interested. And we had actually talked to Rabbi Platnik about it, and he said, well, I don't know. He said, let me talk to Lori. So one Shabbos, she had given her normal class up in the loft of the shul, and we're all exiting the class, and all the women are getting ready to go downstairs to Kiddush. And Lori stops me, and she goes, oh, Marcella, she said, you know, Yaakov told me that you want Robbie to be more Jewishly connected, and she said, you really ought to send him on the men's mission to Israel. And I said, well, you know, we talked about that, but, you know, he'd have to miss so much school, and so I don't think it's really going to work. She goes, school should work for you, not the other way around. She said, so you should send him on that trip. She said, I'm telling you, it's a magical place. And she said, if you want to be Jewish, that's what you need to do. And then she looked at me and she goes, or if you don't, well, then that's another story. And I started to cry. And she looked at me and she goes, come on. And she goes, what's going on? And I said, you know, when I come to shul, there are some things that are so meaningful to me and that really touch me. I said, you know, just the services and being here and learning about Shabbos, I really like that. And the classes I can really connect to. But I said, some things are so foreign to me. I said, when I was in the church, we never prayed more than like 10 minutes for the whole service. I said, we come here and they pray forever. And they go on and on and on. And I said, and there's some things that I don't understand. I said, you know, I peek over on the men's side and they're going like this. And I said, I don't know what that's all about. And I said, you know, it's just, I'm so afraid that I would just like, I can't do it all, Lori, and I don't understand it. And she talked to me a long time, and she said, you really need someone who will learn with you and who will help you. And she said, I'll learn with you. So that was a major thing in itself. But I went home that day, and I guess as Lori had been talking to me, her husband had been talking to my son, Robbie, and he came home and said, I changed my mind. I'm going to Israel. So before he went, Lori said to me, she said, you know, Marcella, there's a special thing, a special tradition, that when someone goes to Israel, they can put notes in the wall at the Kotel. And it's supposed to be a special tradition that those prayers are very special, and oftentimes they are answered very effectively. She says, so if there's anything you want to ask for, this is the time to do it. So I knew what I wanted to ask for because I wanted to be healed of the bladder cancer. So before Robbie went, I wrote out my little prayer, and I gave it to Robbie and asked him to put it in the wall. And when he came back, the next month I was scheduled for another cystoscopy. At this time, I'd had 2 rounds of chemo, one in Oklahoma City, one in Colorado Springs. I'd have over 10 surgeries to remove tumors. And even the surgeries or even the checkups where they didn't find a tumor, a lot of times they'd say, well, you've got a lot of inflammation here, or, you know, here's where you had your resection. And so it was never always such a positive checkup. This time I went in, and I had Dr. Crawford, who they told me is the best in the nation. he did the cystoscopy, and he looked at me and he said, "You never know you had anything." And I have never had a recurrence since then. So I want to publicly thank Hashem, because I do believe that he healed me, and that's been 15 years. So with that, it was such a blessing to me, and I didn't have that distraction of worrying about the chemo and the treatments and the surgeries, that I could focus more on learning about Judaism. So after that discussion with Lori, she began to come to my house every Tuesday and Thursday morning at 9:30, and we would sit down and we would learn. And she became a real sounding board for me, because I could ask her so many questions. She was not raised religious, and so she could relate to a lot of things. And I could ask her questions, and we became real soulmates. And I have to admit that sometimes I loved her, and sometimes I hated her. Like when she would tell me, your kids really need to go to Jewish schools, and they need to have this. Like, well, why can't I just homeschool them? And no, you can't do that. And we would have a lot of discussions about Shabbos, and we stayed the 39 Malakas of Shabbos. And she began to invite me to her house so that I could see what a real Shabbos meal is like. And I began to get to know her family, and I began to slowly, the skepticism and the suspicion about Judaism began to melt away. And I began to see the beauty of Torah and the beauty of Judaism. And I began to really start feeling a love for what Torah Judaism is. So we learned for, a year or so. And of course, we began to try to put into practice the things that I was learning. And I thought I was sort of getting a handle on Shabbos, but then came the Yom Tovim. And that was a whole nother story. I didn't realize that on a Yom Tov, it was much like a Shabbos, that you couldn't drive and you couldn't turn on lights and you couldn't go shopping and you couldn't do this thing. It's like, well, what are you doing the whole time? And I didn't realize how it was. And I remember, especially for Pesach, when we went through that, at the end of it, I said, Lori, I think this was a sign that I wasn't meant to be Jewish. And she said, no, that God just wants to see how much you want it. So we began to still learn and began to study. But, I learned with her probably 2 or 3 years. And occasionally she'd say, well, when do you think that you might be ready to convert? And I'd be like, well, not yet. Because you see, it was very convenient to not be Jewish, because that way I wasn't obligated. So I could practice all these things, but if we had a fast day and I got really hungry, I could still eat. And I wasn't breaking any laws technically. Or if it was Shabbos and I forgot to turn off the light in the bedroom, I could turn the light off. Or if I got embarrassed on a Yom Tov about not wearing makeup, I could put makeup on, because technically I wasn't really doing anything wrong. So this was a very comfortable position to be in. I could learn, and I could go to classes, and I could try to sort of practice, but when it got a little bit like inconvenient or difficult, then I could just say, well, I'm really not doing anything wrong anyway. Okay, but then one year, right before the Pesach Seder, my husband gets a call, and they ask me about a case that he saw in the hospital, and they tell him that he's being placed on investigational leave. Now, I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, but it had to do with a drunk grandmother who was spewing anti-Semitic comments when she saw his yarmulke. So you know what my husband was thinking about during Passover. And at the end of Passover, he was released from his job. Okay, so this was sort of a moment of truth for us, because then we had to decide, what do we want to do? Obviously, he had to have a job. And did we want to stay and try to find a job there in the local area and stay where we were? Or do we want to go back to Ohio? He was actually offered a job in Ohio for twice the salary. And the houses there were half the price of what we were paying in Denver. So that was very tempting. We went online and we looked at all the houses and how beautiful they were, and he could have all this money. And it's like, we hadn't converted yet, so we could really just go back to the way things were. And my kids were good athletes. They liked to play a lot of sports, especially on the weekends. And, there were a lot of things to think about. But it was a real time of soul searching, because I stepped back and I thought, okay, at the end of days, at the end of my life, what do I want to say is most important? Do I want to look back and say, oh, we lived in the most beautiful house. And we had 20 acres behind our house with a swimming pool. And my kids, they were the best athletes ever. My son was the most valuable player on his baseball team. And my other son, he kicked the most goals of anyone else on the team. And, we ate at the finest restaurants. Oh, that one restaurant, it had the best steak you've ever had. Is that what I wanted to say at the end of my life? Or did I want something more? And I realized more important than all those material things was the relationship that I had prayed for so earnestly years before, to have that relationship with God no matter what the cost. And I realized more than anything else, that was the most important thing. And it was that moment of truth that led us to believe that, no, we wanted to stay in Denver and we did want to pursue conversion. So it was in December of 2004 that my husband and I converted to Judaism along with our twins. And the following year, my son, the one that used to eat the chips and the Dr. Pepper when he was 13, he converted. And then my two older sons chose to remain Noahides and to serve the one true God of Israel. So I'm very happy to be part of the Jewish people, but I want to close with one story here that's very meaningful to me. When my husband and I got married back in 1984, someone gave us this wedding gift. And I don't know if you can see it from here, but it's a quote from the book of Ruth. And at that time, I had no idea how prophetic this verse was. It says, "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God." I didn't realize at the time that Ruth was a convert. I didn't realize how prophetic this was, because now your God is my God. And I want to share with you something that happened this year that is very, very meaningful to me, to show that you are also my people. This past year, my son got married. He got married on August 11th to a beautiful Jewish woman. And when they announced their engagement and their wedding, they said it would be in Atlanta, where the girl's from. I remember thinking, I know it's going to be a beautiful wedding, but, I'm not expecting so many people to be there because, after all, we're in Denver and, this is in Atlanta. And so, we'll go there and we'll have a wonderful celebration. But, as far as like seeing people there that we know, well, that's, there's probably not going to be so many people there. So we get there, and when I'm standing up front, my son is collar underneath the chuppah, and we're there with the family, and I'm looking out into the congregation. I look out, and I see not only all the Rebbeim from the yeshiva, not all the Rebbeim, but several of the Rebbeim from the yeshiva, from my son's yeshiva. I see Rabbi Meyer from H. Denver with his wife Chaya. They had been on vacation in L.A., but they left L.A. to fly to Atlanta for the wedding. And then I see Rabbi Pomerantz, who was also on vacation in New York with his family, who came to the wedding. And then I see my Jewish friend Miriam, who was supposed to see her son come home from Israel after being several months in school, but she had her son go pick him up so she could fly to Atlanta for the wedding. And then I see my friend Simi, whose husband was in his year of mourning, so he couldn't come, but she came. And then I see the Weiss family, Mrs. Weiss has a father who's 86 years old and has to have continual care, but she found someone to watch him, and they left their work so that they could come to the wedding. And then I see Mr. Balaban, who's been at our Shabbos table so many times with his 3 sons there. And then I see the Laramers, who used to live in Denver, that moved to South Carolina and drove up for the wedding. And then I see the gals who are our neighbors and our friends from the shul. And then I see the Litzmans, who helped suggest the girl for my son. And then I see Lori Palatnik. And then I see over 20 yeshiva bikers that came just to dance and to join in our simcha of what it means to be a Jew and what it means to carry on the tradition. And it's so wonderful to have that oneness of the Jewish people, because we serve the one true God. I'm so happy to be Jewish. Thank you for letting me share my story. And be careful what you pray for, because you just might get it.